Welcome to Kids Academy.
Hi, it's Coach Rob from Kids Academy, and in our last video we learned about pawn promotion. Today we're going to learn about a second very important pawn rule called en passant. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly, but all my French-speaking students out there know that en passant is French and it means in passing. And it's a special rule that not many players know about. Not many casual chess players know about. And here's how the rule works. Well, before we talk about the rule, let's talk about why en passant came into being, because this is the most recent rule change. It's about 400 years old, but it's the most recent rule change in chess. When chess was first created, pawns could only move one step at a time. So games were a little bit slower. Pawns would start going to e3, black would play e6, white would play e4, black would play e5. And then chess players had the idea, you know what, this is too slow. Let's speed the game up a little bit by allowing pawns to go 2 steps on their first move. So when a pawn is on its starting rank, on its starting square, the pawn has a choice, 1 step or 2. But after that, pawns go 1 at a time. Same as always. So they said, hey, that's a great idea. Let's go ahead and adopt that rule. But then there became a problem, and the problem is this. When you have positions like this, I'll make a move for white, black started playing moves like pawn h7 to h5 and kind of rushing past this white pawn. And then chess players said, well, that's not fair. White should have a chance to capture that pawn as it goes to h5, as it passes by. You can't just run right by me. So that's how en passant came into being. En passant is French, it means in passing, and it's a special rule only for pawns versus pawns. And here it is. If an opposing pawn goes 2 steps in one turn, so he is shoulder to shoulder with your own pawn, on your very next move, and your next move only, you may capture that pawn as though it went 1 square. So I'll go ahead and show you on the computer. We have this white pawn on g5. I'm going to pick it up and move it diagonally forward 1 square to h6. Even though that square is technically empty, you will see the computer will allow me to capture that pawn as though it were still on h6. So in order for this rule to be in effect, white needs to have a pawn on the 5th rank, and a black pawn has to go 2 steps so it is side by side, adjacent to the white pawn. Let's see, if we have a game where the black pawn goes 1 step, and let's say white chooses not to capture that pawn. Maybe white moves the king forward. Oh, that's not a good example. Maybe white defends the pawn by playing pawn f4, and then on black's next turn, the pawn goes to h5. Well, now en passant is no longer allowed. The black pawn did not travel 2 steps in 1 turn. In fact, white already had a chance to capture that pawn when it was on h6. White chose to move pawn f4 instead, and now the black pawn went another step, and it is immune to en passant. So en passant is a special pawn versus pawn rule that happens if a pawn, an opposing pawn, goes 2 steps and kind of zooms by your pawn. So they're shoulder to shoulder, and on your next turn and next turn only, you are able to capture that pawn as though it went 1 step. We saw an example of white using en passant, but is black allowed to? Well, of course. What rank would a black pawn have to be on to use the rule en passant? Think about a white pawn going 2 steps, so he's shoulder to shoulder. I'm going to go ahead and add a white pawn here. Well, the answer is black would have to have a pawn on the 4th rank, and here's a classic example. So as white, I have a pawn on b2. I'm going to play pawn b4. This pawn was on its starting square, so we know it has a choice, 1 step or 2. On black's next turn and next turn only, this pawn can choose to capture. It would look like this. Now, of course, just because black can do the capture doesn't mean it's the best move. In fact, white would capture back and it would be a fair trade. Instead of using en passant in this example, black would be better served just to push the pawn and promote. So en passant is something very important that we need to keep aware of. It doesn't happen that frequently in chess, but when it does, it can have very profound effect on the game. It usually will result in a pawn being able to kind of break free and promote into a queen. It can be a total game changer. So as we play our games, be on the lookout if you have a white pawn on the 5th rank. If a black pawn goes 2 steps in 1 turn, so he's adjacent to your own pawn, you can choose, if you like, to use en passant. But remember, it has to be your very next move. You can't move your king and revisit and say, oh, I'm going to do en passant later. That's not how it works. It has to be immediate. And of course, black can use en passant as well. If there's a black pawn on the 4th rank and a white pawn were to go 2 steps in 1 turn, so they're side by side, we can use en passant in this example as well. The last thing I want to show you is that it's very important for these pawns to be adjacent in order to use the rule. So if we have a position like this, and it's black's turn, and this black pawn goes 2 steps, can this pawn capture en passant, even though white has a pawn on the 5th rank? Well, no, of course not. This isn't how pawns capture. In fact, this sort of looks like a knight L to me. This pawn would be able to use en passant if it were on b5 and it could capture to b6. But in this position, the pawns are not adjacent. They are not shoulder to shoulder. This pawn is not able to capture. So en passant, it means in passing in French. And the idea is that as an opposing pawn passes your own pawn by, you have an immediate option to capture it as though it only went 1 square. Now, if we were playing a tournament game and we were writing this down, we would write one of these moves as, so white's move, let's see, I'll move my king here. So it's black's turn. If this black pawn moves from f7 to f5, white has en passant. In fact, white has 2 choices here because now we have these 3 pawns all shoulder to shoulder. White can either capture en passant using the e pawn or the g pawn, whichever one you choose. White would write this as e x f6, or if we want to use expanded, we would write e5 x, and x stands for capture, remember, f6. We could use g5 if we use the g pawn, g5 x f6. And it's very important to say which pawn we're using because in this case there are actually 2 pawns. We don't use p for pawn, we just use the square name. So e5 x f6 would capture that way, or we can use the g pawn, g5 x f6, and we capture this pawn as it passes through f6 and tries to rush by us. A very handy move that doesn't happen that frequently, but it's very important to know. So always keep your eye out for en passant. Remember, white has a pawn on the 5th rank, black has a pawn on the 4th rank, and you'll be good to go. Now, last thing I'll say before we end this video, like I said earlier, a lot of players aren't aware of this move. So if you come across an opponent that is not aware of en passant, they're not trying to cheat you, they simply are uninformed, and it is your job as an ambassador of chess to let them know about the rule, to tell them it's French, means in passing. You can even tell them a little bit of the history, how it came into being, and soon they'll be understanding, and you'll be able to continue on with your game. Okay, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
Subscribe to our channel to stay updated on new videos. Find links to our apps in the comments below.